Hello and welcome to Future Thinking with Stylus. I'm your host, Christian Ward, Head of Brand Engagement and Multimedia Strategy at Stylus. Today we're going to be discussing the challenges faced by all businesses as they adapt to the current crisis and what every brand needs to be doing right now to emerge from this situation stronger and more resilient. To discuss this with me, I'm joined by Kevin McCullagh, founder of product strategy consultancy Plan, which helps companies like Ford, Airbus and Samsung navigate the early stages of product and service innovation. And Kevin also writes and speaks on mobility, tech and innovation and has been published in the Wall Street Journal, Fast Company, Blueprint and many more. So thanks for joining me, Kevin. First of all, I was wondering, could you tell us a little bit about the work you do at Plan and how that work has refocused in the past few weeks? What sort of questions are your clients asking you now?
Sure. Well, we work, as you mentioned, we work at sort of research and strategy for product and service development. And we focus on kind of two different sectors, and there's quite a mixed impacts across those sectors. So I'll probably look at it in that way. So the two kind of areas are, we look at mobility and tech and food and beverage. So, and they've seen, when we've got clients, to be frank, have got very different experiences of this crisis, quite extremes really. So for example, pretty much all the mobility clients are having a terrible time. You know, not only has the world stopped moving, but the likes of planes and trains and things that have been reframed overnight as high risk areas, you know, infection areas. So lots of these companies are making pretty drastic cuts, and innovation is taking a back seat, so to speak. So that they're having a pretty tough time. The tech clients, it's more of a mixed picture. So you've got some of our telecoms clients say that they're really sort of bending over backwards to meet the massive demand for broadband. You know, they've got customers upgrading their broadband packages, you know, so the revenues are pretty buoyant. And they're starting to think about how they can maybe better support their customers who are expecting to work at home on a more regular basis, for example. And then similarly, we've got hardware clients who are looking at, you know, new opportunities around, you know, cameras, headsets, speakers, to help us all raise our Zoom game, basically. So yeah, there's the tech. I think big tech generally is going to come out of the crisis probably stronger than ever. And then on the food side of things, again, mixed fortunes, I think. We've got one client who's very firmly in this sort of supermarket staples category, and their sales have really been boosted by, you know, everyone being cooped up at home and eating all their meals at home. We've got another food client who's more in the sort of impulse category. So, and they've really been hit by the lack of footfall in physical stores. And interestingly, on a kind of food and beverage sort of innovation standpoint, that the supermarkets are quite a big driver here, because they're basically, let it be known, they're not interested in any innovation for the rest of the year. You know, they've got no problems with sales. Yeah, their problem is fulfillment, and they just see new product as just unwelcome complexity. So our sort of F&B clients are kind of prioritizing more sort of mid to long term initiatives, like hitting their sort of 2025 sustainability targets and things. Right. So it's a, you know, pretty mixed picture with different dynamics going on, to be honest.
So with that mixed picture, I mean, I guess they're all asking you for different sorts of advice. I mean, is there an overall sort of general theme that's emerging from this? I mean, I assume there is something of a pessimistic perspective, perhaps, or is that wrong?
Well, it kind of depends. You know, if you're talking to, you know, we've got some clients that are 20-30% up on sales. So they're feeling sort of slightly guilty about it, but that they're having the best quarter they've ever had, sort of thing. And then you've got others who are literally laying off thousands of workers. So it does really cut to quite different extremes, really.
So there's a post that you put up on LinkedIn recently about this issue of innovate or not during this crisis, and also how to sort of create a resilience after the situation has resolved itself. And in that article, you make a distinction between the accelerated changes, things that are trends that are being accelerated during this period, and more fundamental changes. I wonder if you could give a sort of example of what you mean by both of those.
Yeah, well, I guess it is clear if I talk about the three types of trends I talked about, because you've got certain trends, you've got three types really. You've got the temporary, I call the temporary trends, the sort of during, or DC as I call it in the article, that are essentially blips that will return to steady state of before the crisis. And then you've got two types of more permanent shifts. And those two types of permanent shifts are the accelerated trends and then the new trends. So if I give you an example of each. So with the temporary trends, we were just talking about this earlier, that you've got something like the drop in podcast consumption, which I hear is now starting to recover, but that really dipped to begin with, because things like listening to podcasts on your commute to work or listening to podcasts in the gym, two key use cases, a lot less of that was happening. But you'd expect that to sort of rebound to the kind of trajectory that was set, before Corona. So that would be an example of a temporary trend. And I think that also raises the issue that lots of things will revert back to before Corona kind of trajectories and states. So there's a lot of talk about everything's going to change. I think it's quite important for people to kind of step back and start making distinctions between things that will revert, if you like, those temporary trends that will revert to pretty much continuities with the past, and things that will really change. And I think an interesting one there is, if you look historically at the impact on air travel after two big previous shocks. So if you look at 9/11, if you look at global number of flights, in the year after 9/11, it basically plateaued. It hardly dipped, and then it climbed. And in the decade after 9/11, I think air travel pretty much doubled. And so in the middle of a crisis, you can kind of see lots of change, and you can maybe over-exaggerate how permanent that change can be. And another example would be, a more up-to-date example would be cruise liners. So you have I think it's called the Diamond Princess, the cruise line was quarantined off Japan. Sort of some of the early sort of shock horror headlines of this, this infection hotspot. And already, I find this amazing personally, but already bookings for 2021 in cruise liners are 40% up on bookings for 2019.
Wow.
So, we shouldn't overestimate the amount of change. I think that would be one thing to say. But anyway, onto the two trends that I think you're referring to, the two types. We start with accelerated, and I think that's the most important type of trend. So that's basically pre-existing trends. You could call them BC trends, before Corona trends, that have just been given a massive boost by the crisis. So the obvious example is the Zoom boom. The home working. People have been home working and using Zoom for quite a while, and other products are available. But there's been a massive uptake, if you like, of those, and that's well understood. But I think another parallel example would be the massive boost in telemedicine. So that's virtual visits of doctors, if you like, to their patients. And that's been, I can remember some of the first futurology books I read in the 80s were talking about telemedicine. It's a really old concept, and it's just kind of it's just stayed in the margins, and in pretty much overnight, I've seen there's a quote in the article of a doctor saying he's done more telemedicine visits in one day than he'd done in the previous year.
Wow.
So and what's interesting about that is not it's got over all sorts of barriers, behavioural barriers and attitudes barriers, both on the sides of the doctor and the patient, but also interestingly, governments have swept away sort of legislation as well around. Because I think in the US, I don't think insurers. I'm not totally sure about this, but I don't think medical insurers would insure or pay for a virtual kind of consultation, for example, and that's been swept out the way very, very quickly. So that's a great example of something that's where 10, 20 decades of progress, if you like, have been compressed into 2 weeks. So that's an example of an accelerated trend. And then you've got the kind of brand new trends, the trends that weren't really existent before Corona. And I think it's still quite unclear about which ones these are going to be. So that it's going to be important to track these. But one example of something that might happen is, Westerners adopting the wearing of masks when they're down with a bug. Similar to if you go to Hong Kong or Korea or Singapore, you'll see that that's become standard practice. And I think that became standard practice after the SARS epidemic about 10, 15 years ago. So that, I'm not saying that will happen, but it might happen. And that would be an example of something that wasn't really existent at all. And, the crisis did bring that in. And I think another example from the tech sector is non-touch shared interfaces. So we've all become a lot more concerned about, touching, whether it's door handles or sort of touch screens on ticket machines and things like that. There's going to be a lot more, people are going to be a lot more wary about that. And there's been some experimentation of gestural interfaces, waving your hand around in front of a screen. And it's never really worked. But I think there's going to be a lot more that people are going to look again at that. And I think there's going to be a lot more interest in making those work. So I think that'll be another example of a kind of new trend that was very much stimulated by the crisis.
So, I mean, do you think that of the two, there are specific areas that brands should be more focused on the accelerating trends than they are on the fundamental trends, or both equally? I mean, do you have, is it too difficult to say, or is there a sort of process there?
Well, not to sound like too much like a broken record, it does kind of depend on which sector you're in, and certain trends will be more relevant to certain companies and sectors. But I think if we are going to generalize, I would definitely say that the accelerated trends are going to be the most important. And it's a kind of a point that we make at Plan quite often, is that it's often more useful to understand the evolution or the development of quite a long wave trend, rather than get too carried away with a brand new shiny trend, which might just turn out to be a niche fad. So it's often the development of those long wave trends that drive the real fundamental changes. So yeah, if we're going to generalize, I would say the accelerated trends are going to be the most important.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I'm writing about this from a more of a media and communications perspective at Stylus, but I mean, live streaming is one of the trends that I've been focused on quite heavily at the moment. And again, you have people saying, well, this is just a bump that this technology is getting during this period of lockdown. And when we go back to normal, people will sort of want to go back to sort of passive watching and so on. But I actually think that, there are trends within that behavior which may carry on, the more participatory sort of aspect of what live streaming is doing. So I think I agree, that the accelerating trends, even if they feel like they're bumped because of this situation, will have a sort of core of lasting impact afterwards.
I mean, you've always got to look at the the underlying drivers and the fact that they were existent before COVID would seem to suggest there were some real underlying trends there, and there might have been some barriers to adoption that COVID kind of swept away, sort of thing.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. The barriers of adoption have been sort of dropping rapidly. People are, gaming more, for example. People who probably wouldn't have bothered beforehand are now sort of jumping on things like Animal Crossing. So again, sort of going back to your LinkedIn article, it's very much talking about sort of the challenges of innovation in a situation like this. And I wanted to ask how important do you think innovation and taking risks is for businesses right now? I mean, many of them, many businesses are struggling just to keep their heads above water. Many businesses are bad at risk taking at the best of times. What are your thoughts on, what should people be embracing innovation right now?
Yeah, important but tough could be a summary there. I think you've probably got a bunch of different businesses that are facing kind of quite an existential crisis, and they're going to be ruthlessly conserving cash, and innovation budgets are going to be squeezed or non-existent for a while. So I think that it's going to be a tough environment for some, but it's a different picture. We're in the middle of doing a survey of innovation leaders at the moment, and I just before I came on, I just looked at the latest figures, and there's some interesting things here. So while half of the respondents thought that their budgets would be smaller, 1 in 10 thought they would actually be bigger. So some clients are actually expecting bigger innovation budgets.
Right.
But having said that, a third of people saw that they were going to have to respond to new, permanently shifted consumer attitudes and behaviours, and half expected new types of competitors. So that would suggest that if they don't innovate, they're going to be overtaken by new competitors. And I think that's an interesting and very salient thing to kind of consider, is that we're obviously in a time of massive disruption, but if we think of it classically as an industry disruption in the Clayton Christensen kind of sense, that's kind of defined by the shaking up of the competitive landscape. The competitive rules changing in some way, which gives the chance for new competitors to leapfrog incumbents. And Zoom is a classic example of that. It's less than 10 years old, and it's absolutely smashed it. And it's not just gone up against any competition. It's gone up against Google Hangouts, Microsoft Teams, Apple, Facebook, and Cisco. And now I think Zoom are worth, the last thing I heard, they're worth more than the entire US airline industry. So that's quite an example of a disruptive change, and how competitors can come from nowhere and overtake. So I think while cash is going to be king and tight for many, I think innovation leaders have got to put the case and got to highlight the risks of not innovating and taking some risks at this time.
Yeah, it's very. Interesting that you mentioned Clayton Christensen there. For listeners or watchers who aren't familiar, was the author of The Innovator's Dilemma. Is that right? Is that the right title? I'm just racking my brains. Which talks very much about this idea of disruptors coming in from left field and overtaking. Kodak being, the sort of prime example of a incumbent brand that didn't see the future coming, so to speak. So, this leads quite well into my next question, really, which is thinking a bit further ahead. What can businesses do to protect themselves against future shocks of this magnitude? If more are coming down the line, which it appears that they probably will be.
Yeah, I think resilience is going to be a buzzword for the next few years, to be honest. And I think that'll mean different things to different people and different businesses. But I think a few examples would be some more obvious than others. But I think one of the more obvious ones is just upskilling and equipping their people to work at home more productively. So making sure they've got a good ergonomic setup at home, and I think there's going to be an accelerated take up of sort of remote collaboration tools like Asana, Slack, Google Suite, Miro, stuff like that. I think that also, and another thing that came up in the survey that we're doing is that a third of the innovation leaders that responded agreed with the statement, my team's capabilities aren't aligned with the new challenges. So I think there's going to be quite a lot of training needs to be done.
Yeah.
And then on the more sort of operational side, there's going to be quite a push, I think, to sort of simplify, shorten, and diversify supply chains. So, I think there's people have felt quite stung by just how quickly supply chains sort of began to dry up, and probably a bit of a sense of an over-reliance on complex supply chains and over-reliance on China, maybe. So I think we're going to hear a lot more talk about, not self-reliance, but a bit more sourcing locally, or at least nearer than China, particularly for sort of more critical sectors like food and medical supplies. I think there'll be probably a bit more rhetoric about that than the actual reality, because I think it'll be very hard to do. The global economy is far too interdependent. But I think there'll definitely be building in more capacity, more sort of holding more stock and things like that, to make their supply chains more resilient. So I think there'll be lots of different ways of making companies more resilient, but there'll be a few examples. So
we've talked sort of mainly here about the impact on businesses. I wonder if we could sort of finish with thinking about the consumer and how open they are to experiment with new consumption behaviors, and what sort of behaviors that you think might stick around in the long term.
Okay, well, again, I think it's one of the things that I think is really interesting about this whole crisis is that it's kind of, the concept, the Overton window. It's the acceptable things that you can discuss and do, and I think that the Overton window has really widened in this crisis. So I think some things that might have been seen as just not even something you wouldn't consider, and now on the table, at least for considering. So I think that's something. So I think the whole how people work is an obvious one. To what extent people actually need, and particularly we're going to see some things are going to be driven by economics. I mean, people are talking about this being the sharpest economic decline since the 20s, even worse than the Second World War. So I think that's going to put lots of financial pressure on big sections of society. So, for example, when people have been managing to stay fit, in the park or in front of Joe Wicks, do they need that gym membership? When money's tight? I think that's an example. So we shouldn't underestimate the effects of quite a protracted recession on behaviours, rather than just the experience that people have had over the last month or so. But I think there's, I think in terms of how, I think it's how consumers, and I think I mentioned before that I think a third of our respondents expected consumer attitudes and behaviours to change. So but companies are already sort of tooling up to respond to that. And I think there's a nice quote that I saw recently from Rahm Emanuel. I'm not a big fan of him particularly, but I like the quote. He's the ex-right-hand man of Obama, and he was talking about the last economic crisis in 2008, just before Obama took power. And there was a quote, he said that, you should never let a crisis go to waste. And what I mean by that, there's an opportunity to do things that you could not do before. And I think that will be the case both on the consumer side of things, but also on the business side of things. That's things that you just wouldn't have considered doing before are now on the table. And I think that's the exciting thing to a certain extent. And I think that's what's going to lead to quite a lot of disruption. I think because you know the rules are changing, and I haven't got lots of specific examples for you, but I think just generally the context is a lot more fluid going forward, and you know, lots of things that were cast in stone before are now shattered, and people are thinking very, very differently. So I think we could probably see, we might look back in 3 or 4 years' time on this period and see quite a massive explosion of innovation happening, which you know, is hard to see right now, but I think we could look back and see that.
Well, that's great. It's a very inspiring way to look at it, and a nice sort of positive way to end. Thank you very much, Kevin McCullagh, for joining me, and thank you for listening or watching if you are watching. Please join us next time for more future thinking from Stylus, and stay safe. Thank you.